I got the call at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Not the kind of call you expect from family, especially when you haven't heard from them in months. It was Kevin, my younger brother, and he was drunk, really drunk. The kind of drunk where words slumble together and old resentments spill out like cheap wine. Marcus, he slurred into the phone. Jessica and I are getting married. Big wedding, real classy affair. Not that you'd understand what that costs. I sat up in my king-sized bed in my downtown Austin penthouse, looking out at the city lights, and felt that familiar knot form in my stomach. The same knot I'd carried since I was 18 and left Cedar Falls, Iowa for basic training. Here we go again, I thought. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You know what the funny part is, he continued, not waiting for my response. Mom and Dad keep asking if we should invite you. Like, what are you gonna do? Show up in your uniform and embarrass us? You probably can't even afford the gas money to drive here. I stayed quiet, letting him ramble, because I'd learned a long time ago that Kevin needed an audience, not a conversation partner. But hey, he said, his voice getting meaner, the way it always did when he drank. At least Jessica's dad is paying for most of it. Unlike some people, we actually have family that can help out. Real family with real jobs, not playing soldier and pretending it matters. That's when I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly. More like clarity. Kevin had always been the golden child. The one who went to college, got the business degree, landed the corporate job. The one who never left Iowa, never questioned Dad's politics, never made waves. I was the screw-up who joined the army because I couldn't afford college and came back broken, or at least that's how they saw it. They had no idea what I'd built in the 8 years since my discharge. Fine, I said quietly, send me the details, I'll see what I can do, and I hung up before he could say anything else that would make me do something I might regret, or maybe something I wouldn't regret at all. The next morning, I sat in my office on the 32nd floor of the Austin Financial Tower, looking at my company's quarterly reports. Thomson Cyber Solutions wasn't just successful, it was dominating the government contracting space. Military cybersecurity, defense systems integration, classified network architecture, the skills I'd learned as a Signal Corps specialist, had translated into an 8-figure business that kept growing every month. My assistant knocked on the door. Marcus, she said, Victoria Sterling is here for your 10 o'clock. Right, I thought. The meeting I'd scheduled to discuss a potential acquisition. Victoria Sterling was one of the most exclusive wedding planners in the Midwest, someone who catered to Fortune 500 executives and political dynasties. I'd been considering buying her company as a diversification play, something completely outside my wheelhouse but with solid fundamentals. Victoria walked in wearing a sharp navy suit and carrying herself like someone who was used to dealing with serious money. She was probably in her 40s, perfectly put together, with the kind of confidence that came from making impossible things happen for people who wouldn't accept no for an answer. Mr. Thompson, she said, settling into the leather chair across from my desk, I've reviewed your preliminary offer, and I have to say, I'm intrigued. Not many cybersecurity executives branch out into luxury event planning. I smiled, pouring coffee from the service my assistant had set up. Let's just say I believe in diversification. Your client base is impressive, and the profit margins are better than most people realize. We spent an hour going through financials, client retention rates, and market positioning. Victoria knew her business inside and out, and I found myself genuinely interested in the logistics of managing high-end events. There was something appealing about creating perfect moments instead of preventing digital disasters. Actually, she said as we wrapped up, I have to ask. You wouldn't happen to be related to a Kevin Thompson in Cedar Falls, would you? I'm coordinating his wedding next month, and the bride mentioned his brother was named Marcus and had served in the military. Small world if that's you. I felt my coffee cup pause halfway to my lips. That would be me, I said carefully. Kevin's my younger brother. Victoria's eyebrows raised slightly. Well, this is interesting. I've been trying to reach your family about some last-minute arrangements. The venue they originally booked had a kitchen fire last week, and we're scrambling to find alternatives. Your brother seemed quite stressed about the costs involved. She paused, studying my face. I don't suppose you'd have any suggestions for someone with, shall we say, a more flexible budget? I set down my coffee and leaned back in my chair. Tell me about their situation. Victoria explained that Kevin and Jessica had been planning a $150,000 wedding at the Grand Pavilion at Riverside Gardens, but the fire damage meant they were looking at either postponing for 6 months or finding a more expensive alternative on short notice. The family was panicking about the additional costs, especially since Jessica's father had already stretched his budget to cover the original amount. What kind of alternatives are we talking about? I asked. Victoria pulled out her tablet and showed me several venues. There was the Riverside Estate, a stunning property overlooking the Iowa River, but it would cost an additional $75,000. The historic Mansion District had availability, but that was even more expensive. Then there was Willowbrook Manor, a private estate that rarely opened for events, but the owner was asking $200,000 just for the venue rental. That last one caught my attention. Tell me about Willowbrook Manor. Victoria's eyes lit up. It's absolutely spectacular. 40 acres of manicured grounds, a mansion built in the 1920s by a railroad baron, formal gardens, a private lake. The owner, Margaret Sinclair, is incredibly selective about who she allows to use the property. I've been trying to book it for clients for years, but she's turned down tech billionaires and Hollywood royalty. She values exclusivity over money. Interesting, I said. What makes her say yes? Victoria shrugged. Legacy usually. She wants events that mean something, that will be remembered. She's 93, and sees the manor as her final gift to the world. Couples who book there become part of the property's history. I nodded slowly, an idea forming in my mind, and the $200,000 is just the venue. Just the venue, Victoria confirmed. That doesn't include catering, flowers, music, photography. A wedding there could easily cost $500,000. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Austin skyline. My brother thought I couldn't afford gas money to drive to Iowa. My parents still asked if I needed money when they called, which wasn't often. They had no idea that I'd made more in the last quarter than Kevin would make in his entire corporate career. Victoria, I said, still looking out the window, what if I told you I was interested in making this wedding happen at Willowbrook Manor? She was quiet for a moment. Mr. Thompson, I appreciate
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Family loyalty, but we're talking about serious money here. Your brother mentioned that finances were already tight, and I wouldn't want to put additional pressure on your family. I turned around and smiled. What if finances weren't an issue? What if someone was willing to cover the entire cost, including the upgrade to Willowbrook Manor? Victoria's expression changed from polite concern to sharp attention. Are we talking about a loan situation? She asked carefully. Because I've seen family financial arrangements go bad, and weddings bring out the worst in people. No loan, I said. A gift, anonymous, if possible. I'd like Kevin and Jessica to have the wedding of their dreams without ever knowing where the money came from. At least, not initially. Victoria stared at me for a long moment. Mr. Thompson, if you don't mind me asking, what exactly is your net worth? I picked up the Forbes magazine from my desk, the one with my company featured in their fastest-growing private companies issue. Enough to make this happen without affecting my lifestyle in any meaningful way. Victoria took the magazine and flipped to the article, her eyes widening as she read. Thomson Cyber Solutions, private cybersecurity firm, estimated annual revenue exceeding $50 million, founded by former Army Signal Corps specialist Marcus Thompson. She looked up at me. Your brother has no idea, does he? None of them do. They still think I'm the family disappointment who couldn't make it in civilian life. Victoria shook her head slowly. This is either the most generous thing I've ever seen, or you're setting up the most expensive family confrontation in wedding planning history. Maybe both, I admitted. But here's what I want to do. Contact Mrs. Sinclair and arrange the booking, cover all costs, flowers, catering, photography, the works. But I want you to tell my family that an anonymous benefactor has offered to sponsor the wedding as part of a charitable initiative for military families. Don't mention my name, in connection with the money, until after the wedding is over. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, thinking through the implications. This is going to require a significant deposit, she said finally. Mrs. Sinclair will want proof that the funds are available before she'll even consider the booking. How significant? I asked. She pulled out her phone and made a quick calculation. To secure Willowbrook Manor and guarantee all the services, we'd need a deposit of $2 million in escrow within 48 hours. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out my checkbook. The kind of checkbook that came with unlimited access to business accounts that held more money than my family could comprehend. $2 million, I said, writing out the check. That should cover the deposit and leave enough for any additional expenses that come up. Victoria stared at the check, like it might disappear if she blinked. Mr. Thompson, she said carefully. Are you absolutely sure about this? Once Mrs. Sinclair accepts this deposit, there's no backing out. The money will be committed, and your brother is going to have questions when he finds out about the upgrade. I'm counting on it, I said. Kevin spent his whole life thinking he was the successful one, the one who made it while his soldier brother struggled to find his place. Maybe it's time he learned that success comes in different forms. Victoria stood up, still holding the check. I'll make the calls this afternoon. Mrs. Sinclair will be intrigued by the story, and the deposit will certainly get her attention. But Marcus, she said, using my first name for the first time, be prepared for this to change everything between you and your family. Sometimes people don't react well to learning they've been wrong about someone for years. I walked her to the door, thinking about Kevin's drunk phone call, about years of family gatherings, where I was treated like the poor relation, about Christmas gifts I'd bought for them, that cost more than their monthly salaries while they gave me gift cards to chain restaurants. Maybe it's time for things to change, I said. Victoria smiled and shook my hand. I'll call you this evening with an update. And Marcus, she added as she stepped into the hallway, for what it's worth, I think your brother is about to get a very expensive education about making assumptions. After she left, I sat back down at my desk and looked out at Austin again. My phone buzzed with a text from my business partner about a new contract we'd just landed with the Department of Defense, worth $12 million over 3 years. Standard Tuesday afternoon, for Thompson Cyber Solutions. I thought about Kevin, probably sitting in his cubicle in Cedar Falls, worrying about wedding costs and wondering how he was going to afford the life he wanted to project. He had no idea that his broke older brother had just written a check for more money than he'd see in a decade. And in less than 48 hours, when Victoria called with news about the venue change, Kevin was going to start asking questions that I wasn't ready to answer. Not yet anyway. But I was looking forward to seeing his face when he found out who really paid for his perfect wedding. The call came that evening, just as I was finishing a workout in my private gym. Victoria's voice was excited but professional, the tone of someone who'd just pulled off something extraordinary. Marcus, she said, I have news. Mrs. Sinclair said yes. I stopped mid-rep on the bench press and sat up. She said yes, just like that. Not just like that, Victoria laughed. It took some convincing. I told her about the military angle, about a successful veteran wanting to honor his brother's service by giving him an unforgettable wedding. She was intrigued by the story, but what really sold her was the deposit. She's been approached by wealthy families before, but never someone willing to put down $2 million without negotiating or asking for special accommodations. I toweled off and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The Austin skyline was lit up against the Texas evening, a view that never got old. What did you tell her about me specifically? I asked. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I told her the truth. That you're a former soldier who built a successful business and wanted to do something meaningful for your family. She appreciated the discretion, the fact that you're not looking for publicity or recognition. Good, I said. What's the timeline? Victoria explained that Mrs. Sinclair was so impressed by the gesture that she was personally overseeing the preparations. The wedding was 6 weeks away, which was incredibly tight for an event of this magnitude, but she was calling in favors with florists, caterers, and musicians who rarely worked on short notice. The total cost was going to be significantly higher than the original $150,000 budget, closer to $400,000 when everything was factored in. I did some quick math in my head. $400,000 represented about 2 days of revenue for my company. Kevin made $65,000 a year at his corporate job, and probably thought that was impressive. The irony wasn't lost on me. "And you're sticking with the anonymous benefactor story?" I asked. Victoria confirmed that she'd already called Kevin and Jessica with the news, telling them that a charitable foundation focused on military families had selected them for sponsorship. How did they react? I asked, genuinely curious. Victoria chuckled. Kevin was suspicious at first. He kept asking questions about the foundation, wanting to know why they'd been chosen. Jessica was over the moon, talking about how it was fate and destiny. "Your parents," she paused. "Your parents seemed confused but grateful. Your mother cried when I described the venue. That hit me harder than I expected. Mom crying over something beautiful happening for Kevin, something she thought was impossible. I remembered her working double shifts at the diner when we were kids, trying to keep the lights on while Dad drank away his disability checks. She'd always dreamed of giving us more than she could afford, and now, without knowing it, she was going to watch her son get married in a mansion that railroad barons had called home. There's just one complication," Victoria continued. "Kevin wants to meet with the foundation representative. He's insisting on a face-to-face meeting to express his gratitude and understand what's expected of him in return. He seems to think there must be strings attached." I laughed, because of course Kevin would be suspicious. He'd never received anything in his life without conditions, without having to prove he deserved it. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "That you'd arrange something, but it might take time to coordinate with the foundation's schedule. I figured that would buy us some time to figure out how you want to handle this." I walked to my home office and looked at the wall of commendations and certificates from my military service. Distinguished Service Medal, Army Commendation Medal, certifications in cybersecurity and intelligence analysis. Achievements that my family had never asked about, never celebrated. "Set up the meeting," I said. "But not as the foundation representative. I'll come as myself, as Kevin's brother, who's curious about this generous gift. Let him explain to me what happened, let him show off about this amazing wedding he's having." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Marcus," she said carefully, "are you sure that's wise? He's going to be asking questions about how you can afford to attend, where you're staying, what you're driving. Your cover story is going to get harder to maintain." "Let me worry about that," I said. "Just arrange for me to be there when you meet with them about the final details. I want to see Kevin's face when he's describing this incredible opportunity to his poor older brother who can barely afford gas money." Victoria sighed, but I could hear the intrigue in her voice. "You're playing a dangerous game, but I have to admit, I'm curious to see how this plays out." After we hung up, I opened my laptop and started making travel arrangements. A private jet from Austin to Cedar Falls would be too obvious, too easy to trace. But I could fly commercial first class and rent something appropriately modest when I landed. Maybe a nice but not flashy sedan, something that fit the image of a struggling veteran who'd scraped together enough money to attend his brother's wedding. I thought about the last time I'd been home, 18 months ago for Dad's birthday. Kevin had made a big show of picking up the check at dinner, waving off my attempt to pay with a comment about how I probably needed to save my money. Mom had slipped me a $50 bill when she hugged me goodbye, whispering that I should get something nice for myself. Dad had shaken my hand and asked if I was still doing that computer stuff, like my career was a hobby I'd outgrow eventually. They had no idea that I owned a penthouse worth more than their house, that I drove cars worth more than their annual salaries, that my company employed over 200 people and held contracts with agencies they'd only seen in movies. I'd kept it quiet, partly out of humility, partly because I knew how they'd react. they'd either not believe it or find ways to diminish it, to make it about luck or timing rather than the work I'd put in. But now Kevin was getting married, and he was about to have the wedding of his dreams, because his broke older brother had decided to make it happen. The brother he'd mocked on a drunk phone call, the brother he thought was an embarrassment to the family. I opened my calendar and blocked out a week in Iowa. This was going to be interesting. The next morning, I had a conference call with 3 Pentagon officials about upgrading their network security protocols, routine stuff, the kind of multi-million-dollar contract that I handled before my first cup of coffee these days. But I found myself distracted, thinking about Kevin and Jessica and the bomb I was about to drop on their carefully ordered world. My assistant came in with a stack of documents that needed signatures. "Marcus," she said, "your accountant called about the wedding expenses. He wants to confirm that you want them categorized as personal gifts rather than charitable donations." I looked up from the contract I was reviewing. "Personal gifts," I confirmed. "This isn't about tax breaks, it's about family." She nodded and made a note. "Also, Victoria Sterling's office called. They've confirmed the meeting for next Thursday at the venue. Kevin and Jessica Thompson will be there, along with Mrs. Sinclair, who wants to meet the family personally." I smiled at that. Mrs. Sinclair was going to be in for a surprise when she met the humble military brother and realized he was the same person who'd written the $2 million check. "Perfect," I said. "And book me a flight to Cedar Falls for Wednesday night, something commercial, not the company jet." She raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. My assistant had worked for me long enough to know that I sometimes had unconventional approaches to business and family matters. That afternoon, I drove out to my property in the hill country, a 1,000-acre ranch I'd bought the previous year as an investment and retreat. The main house was still under construction, but I'd had a temporary office built where I could work when I needed to get away from the city. I sat on the porch, looking out at the rolling hills and thinking about the path that had brought me here. 8 years ago, I'd left the Army as a staff sergeant with specialized skills in cybersecurity and signals intelligence. I'd saved every penny of my deployment pay, avoided the drinking and spending that claimed so many of my fellow soldiers, and used my GI Bill benefits to get certifications in emerging technologies. My first government contract was worth $50,000, a job that took me 3 months to complete working nights and weekends from my studio apartment. Kevin had laughed when I told him I was starting my own business. He'd said something about how government contracts were impossible to get without connections, how I should focus on finding a steady job with benefits. Dad had agreed, suggesting I apply to the post office or the county government, something stable and secure. They didn't understand that I was building something bigger than job security. I was building wealth, influence, and independence. Now Thompson Cyber Solutions employed former military personnel almost exclusively, giving veterans the kind of opportunities I'd had to create for myself. We'd prevented cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, protected classified military communications, and built secure networks for agencies that couldn't afford to be compromised. My work mattered, my team mattered, and the money we made was just a reflection of the value we provided. But none of that meant anything to my family, because they'd never seen it. They still thought of me as the kid who couldn't afford college, who joined the Army because he had no other options. Kevin was the success story, with his business degree, and his corporate job, and his 401k that he bragged about at family gatherings. He was the one who'd made it, who'd figured out how to thrive in the civilian world. In 6 days, that was all going to change. Kevin was going to walk into the most exclusive venue in Iowa for a meeting about his wedding, and he was going to discover that his broke older brother was the reason he could afford to have that conversation. The brother he'd dismissed, the brother he'd mocked, the brother who'd apparently been subsidizing his dream wedding while he slept. I pulled out my phone and called Victoria. "I want to make one change to the plan," I said when she answered. "What kind of change?" she asked. "I want you to arrange for Kevin to see the check," I said. "Not immediately, not as soon as he walks in, but at some point during that meeting, I want him to see the deposit paperwork with my signature on it." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Marcus," she said carefully, "that's going to be explosive. He's going to have questions, and not all of them are going to be comfortable for you to answer. I'm counting on it," I said. Kevin spent years thinking he was the family success story. Maybe it's time he learned what real success looks like. The flight to Cedar Falls was turbulent, which seemed fitting given what I was about to unleash on my family. I'd chosen a middle seat on a regional airline, the kind of uncomfortable experience that would reinforce my cover story if anyone happened to see me at the airport. The businessman next to me spent the entire flight complaining about a delayed conference call that might cost him a $20,000 deal, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from mentioning that I'd made 3 times that amount while he was talking. I rented a Ford Fusion at the airport, silver and forgettable, exactly what someone would expect a struggling veteran to drive. The GPS guided me through familiar streets toward the Comfort Inn on the edge of town, where I'd booked a basic room for appearances. Cedar Falls looked smaller than I remembered, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and nobody ever really left, except I had left, and I'd built something they couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. The hotel room was exactly what I expected.
Same but dated.
With a view of the parking lot and the faint smell of industrial carpet cleaner. I set my laptop on the small desk and checked my encrypted email, reviewing the latest intelligence reports from my team back in Austin. 3 potential security breaches identified and neutralized while I was in flight, another government contract proposal submitted, and a reminder about the board meeting next week where we'd discuss expanding into European markets. My phone buzzed with a text from Kevin. "Hey bro, heard you were coming to town, Mom's excited to see you, we should grab coffee tomorrow before the venue meeting. I want to tell you about this crazy thing that happened with the wedding." I smiled as I typed back a simple response. "Sounds good, looking forward to catching up." Kevin had no idea that I already knew every detail about his crazy thing, that I'd orchestrated the entire situation from my office in Austin. He was probably rehearsing how he'd tell the story, how he'd present himself as the grateful but worthy recipient of this anonymous generosity. The thought of his face when he discovered the truth was worth the uncomfortable hotel bed I'd be sleeping in tonight. The next morning, I met Kevin at Miller's Breakfast Nook, the same diner where Mom had worked double shifts during our childhood. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now wealthy enough to buy the entire building, but I was sitting in a cracked vinyl booth, pretending to study the menu like the prices mattered. Kevin arrived 15 minutes late, rushing in with his phone pressed to his ear, finishing what sounded like an important work call. "Marcus," he said, sliding into the booth across from me and barely looking up from his phone. "Sorry, crisis at the office, you know how it is." Actually, I didn't know how it was to have a crisis that involved arguing with vendors about delivery schedules, but I nodded anyway. Kevin looked good, I had to admit, his corporate job had been kind to him, with a healthy tan from weekend golf and clothes that probably cost more than he realized. He'd always been the handsome one, the charming one, the one who could talk his way into or out of anything. "So," he said, finally putting his phone down and actually focusing on me, "how are things? Still doing the computer security stuff?" I stirred sugar into my coffee and gave him the response he expected. "Yeah, still plugging away at it, government contracts, mostly, nothing too exciting, but it pays the bills." Kevin nodded with the kind of sympathetic expression that people use when they're trying to be supportive about someone else's modest career. "That's good, man. Steady work is important. I've been telling Jessica that we should probably help you out more, especially with the wedding coming up. I know travel expenses and everything can add up." He reached into his wallet and pulled out $200 bills, sliding them across the table with the casual generosity of someone who thought he was being magnanimous. "For gas money, and maybe a new shirt for the ceremony." I stared at the money for a moment, thinking about the irony of my millionaire brother offering me $200 while sitting in a diner that I could buy without affecting my monthly budget. But I took the bills and tucked them into my wallet, because that's what the broke older brother would do. "Thanks, Kevin, that's really thoughtful of you." His chest puffed up slightly, the way it always did when he got to play the successful younger brother taking care of his struggling older sibling. "Which brings me to the crazy news," he said, leaning forward with excitement. "You're not going to believe what happened with our wedding. We had this disaster, right? The original venue had a kitchen fire, and we thought we were screwed. Jessica was crying, her dad was freaking out about losing the deposits, and I'm thinking we might have to postpone everything." I leaned back and let him tell the story, watching his animated gestures and the way his eyes lit up as he described the phone call from Victoria Sterling. "This high-end wedding planner calls us out of nowhere," he said. "Apparently, there's this charitable foundation that sponsors weddings for military families, and somehow they picked us. Can you believe that, out of all the veterans in Iowa, they chose me?" "That's incredible," I said, injecting just the right amount of amazement into my voice. "What kind of venue are we talking about?" Kevin's grin widened, and he pulled out his phone to show me pictures. "Willowbrook Manor," he said, swiping through images of manicured gardens and marble staircases. "This place is like something out of a movie. The owner is this 93-year-old woman who barely lets anyone use it. Tech billionaires have been turned down, but somehow our story touched her heart." I looked at the photos, pretending to see them for the first time instead of having studied the property extensively while making the arrangements. "Kevin, this looks like it cost a fortune. How does a charitable foundation afford something like this?" He shrugged, but I caught a flicker of something in his expression. Maybe uncertainty? Maybe the beginning of suspicion? "That's what I keep wondering," he admitted. The wedding planner was pretty vague about the details. Said the foundation prefers to remain anonymous, that they don't want recognition for their generosity. "But Marcus," he leaned forward and lowered his voice, "we're talking about a venue that normally costs $200,000 just for the rental. Add in catering, flowers, photography, music, and this wedding is probably going to cost $500,000. I nearly choked on my coffee, not because of the amount, but because Kevin was so close to figuring out that no charitable foundation in the world would spend that kind of money on a single wedding. "What does Jessica think about all this?" I asked. Kevin's expression softened the way it always did when he talked about his fiancée. "She thinks it's destiny. She says the universe is rewarding us for being good people, for staying true to each other through the tough times." "What tough times?" I wondered, but I didn't ask. Kevin and Jessica had been together for 3 comfortable years, living in a nice apartment, taking regular vacations, building their perfect middle-class life without any real struggle or sacrifice. But everyone likes to believe they've overcome something, that they've earned their happiness through adversity. "The funny thing is," Kevin continued, "I keep feeling like I should know more about this foundation. I've tried researching it online, but there's hardly any information available. The wedding planner says that's intentional, that they operate quietly to avoid being overwhelmed with requests. But it makes me nervous, you know. Like maybe there's a catch we haven't figured out yet. Maybe they just want to do something nice," I suggested. "Not everything has to have an angle." Kevin looked at me with the kind of patronizing smile that older siblings reserve for younger ones who don't understand how the world really works. "Marcus," he said gently, "nobody spends $500,000 on strangers without wanting something in return. That's not how business works." I finished my coffee and tried not to laugh at the irony of Kevin explaining business to me while I was sitting on contracts worth more than his annual salary. "You're probably right," I said. "I'm sure you'll figure it out. Speaking of which, when do I get to see this amazing venue?" Kevin checked his watch and signaled for the check. "Actually, we have a meeting there this afternoon. Final details with the wedding planner and the property owner. You should come with us." I'd been counting on this invitation, but I acted surprised. "Are you sure? I don't want to intrude on your wedding planning." Kevin waved off my concern. "Mom and Dad are coming too. It'll be like a family outing. Besides, I want you to see what your little brother managed to pull off." His pride was so genuine that I almost felt guilty about what was going to happen in a few hours. We drove separately to Willowbrook Manor, Kevin in his leased BMW and me in my rental Ford, following a winding road through Iowa farmland that gradually gave way to more expensive real estate. The manor appeared through a grove of ancient oak trees like something from a fairy tale, all stone facades and towering chimneys and windows that caught the afternoon sunlight like jewels. I'd seen pictures of the property during my research, but experiencing it in person was different. The gardens alone probably cost more to maintain than most people's houses, with geometric hedges and fountain displays that spoke of old money and older traditions. This wasn't just a venue, it was a statement about status and legacy, exactly the kind of place where Kevin would feel validated about his success and importance. Mom and Dad were already there, standing near the main entrance looking overwhelmed and slightly out of place. Dad wore his best suit, the one he'd bought for Kevin's college graduation, and Mom had clearly spent hours getting ready for what she probably saw as the most important meeting of her life. They looked like tourists at a museum, afraid to touch anything expensive. "Marcus," Mom called out when she saw me, rushing over for a hug that lasted longer than usual. "I'm so glad you could make it. Can you believe this place? Kevin's getting married here, at this beautiful mansion." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and I realized this moment meant everything to her. Her youngest son, the one who'd always been her pride and joy, was having the wedding she'd dreamed about but never thought they could afford. "It's incredible, Mom," I said, squeezing her hand. "Kevin should be proud." Dad shook my hand with his usual awkward formality, but I could see he was impressed despite himself. He'd always been suspicious of good fortune, convinced that anything too good to be true probably was. But even his natural cynicism couldn't diminish the grandeur of what we were looking at. Victoria Sterling appeared at the main entrance, dressed in a different but equally sharp suit and carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my rental car. She greeted Kevin and Jessica with professional warmth, shook hands with Mom and Dad, and then turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You must be Marcus," she said, extending her hand. "Kevin's told me so much about you. I'm Victoria Sterling, the event coordinator. It's wonderful that you could join us today." I shook her hand, noting the slight emphasis she'd placed on my name, and wondered if she was having second thoughts about the plan we'd devised. "Mrs. Sinclair is waiting for us in the conservatory," Victoria announced. "She's excited to meet the family and discuss the final arrangements." We followed her through the mansion's main hall, past oil paintings of long-dead railroad barons and furniture that belonged in museums. Kevin walked slightly ahead of the group, his chest puffed out with pride, while Jessica clung to his arm and whispered about how perfect everything was. The conservatory was a stunning glass room filled with exotic plants and comfortable seating arrangements that probably cost more than most people's cars. Mrs. Margaret Sinclair was waiting for us, a tiny woman in her 90s, who carried herself with the kind of dignity that came from a lifetime of wealth and influence. She rose from her chair with the help of an elegant walking stick, and surveyed our family with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Welcome to Willowbrook Manor," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades hosting important people. "I'm delighted to meet the Thompson family and hear about this wonderful foundation that's making your wedding possible." Kevin stepped forward, automatically assuming his role as family spokesperson, and began expressing his gratitude with the kind of polished speech he'd probably practiced in the mirror. Mrs. Sinclair listened politely, but I noticed her attention kept drifting to me. She was studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle, and I realized she was probably trying to reconcile the humble military brother with the wealthy benefactor who'd written her the $2 million check. Victoria had been discreet, but Mrs. Sinclair hadn't survived 93 years without developing excellent instincts about people and money. The meeting proceeded smoothly, with Victoria walking through the timeline and logistics, while Kevin and Jessica asked questions about flowers and photography and menu selections. Mom kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, overwhelmed by the luxury surrounding us, while Dad maintained his suspicious silence, clearly waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then Mrs. Sinclair made an unexpected announcement. I have something I'd like to share with you, she said, reaching into a small side table and withdrawing a leather-bound book. This is the Willowbrook Manor Guest Registry, where every couple who's been married here signs their names and leaves a message for future generations. She opened the book to reveal pages of elegant handwriting, signatures from couples whose weddings had become part of the property's history. I'd like Kevin and Jessica to add their names today, as a commitment to the legacy they're becoming part of. It's unusual to do this before the wedding, but given the special circumstances of your sponsorship, I think it's appropriate. Kevin beamed as he took the expensive pen Mrs. Sinclair offered, signing his name with a flourish before passing it to Jessica. As Jessica signed, Mrs. Sinclair continued talking. The foundation that's sponsoring your wedding is truly remarkable. In all my years of hosting events here, I've never encountered such generosity from an organization dedicated to honoring military service. She paused, her eyes finding mine across the room. Of course, sometimes the most meaningful gifts come from unexpected sources. Victoria cleared her throat and opened her portfolio. Speaking of the foundation, she said, I have the final deposit paperwork that needs to be reviewed. Mrs. Sinclair, if you could confirm the payment details for our records. She withdrew several documents, including what I recognized as copies of the $2 million check and bank transfer confirmations. Kevin leaned forward, curious about the financial details he'd been wondering about for days. What kind of numbers are we looking at here? He asked. Victoria glanced at me, and I gave her the slightest nod. She placed the documents on the coffee table where everyone could see them, including the deposit check with my signature clearly visible at the bottom. The total deposit was $2 million, Victoria said, matter-of-factly. That covers the venue, catering, flowers, photography, music, and all additional services. Kevin's eyes widened as he processed the amount, but then he focused on the signature line, and I watched his expression change from amazement to confusion, to something approaching shock. Wait, he said, picking up the check and staring at the signature. This says Marcus Thompson. He looked up at me, then back at the check, then at Victoria. Is this some kind of mistake? There was complete silence in the conservatory. Mom and Dad leaned forward, trying to see what Kevin was looking at, while Jessica peered over his shoulder with growing confusion. Mrs. Sinclair smiled, the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. Mr. Thompson, she said, addressing me directly, would you like to explain? Or shall I? The weight of everyone's attention settled on me like a physical force. Kevin was still holding the check, his face cycling through emotions I'd never seen from him before. This was it, the moment I'd been planning since that drunk phone call weeks ago. I stood up slowly, straightening my shoulders the way I'd learned in the army, and looked at each member of my family in turn. There's something I need to tell you all, I said, my voice calm and steady, about what I've been doing since I left the service, about the business I've built, and about why I decided Kevin's wedding needed to happen at Willowbrook Manor. Kevin's hand was shaking slightly as he held the check. Marcus, he whispered. What is this? What's going on? I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew my business card, the one with the Thomson Cyber Solutions logo and my title as founder and CEO. I handed it to him, watching as he read it with growing disbelief. The anonymous foundation doesn't exist, Kevin. It never did. The money came from me, from the company I built after I left the army. Thomson Cyber Solutions is worth more than $50 million, and I wrote that check because I wanted you to have the wedding of your dreams. Even after you told me I probably couldn't afford gas money to drive here. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Kevin stared at the business card, then at the check, then back at me. Mom's tissue had fallen from her nerveless fingers, and Dad's face had gone completely white. Jessica looked like she was trying to solve a complex math problem in her head, while Victoria and Mrs. Sinclair watched the family drama unfold with professional detachment. Finally, Kevin found his voice. $50 million, he repeated slowly. You own a $50 million company, and you let us think you were struggling to pay rent. You let Dad slip you $20 for gas last Christmas. You let Mom worry about whether you had enough to eat. You let me. He stopped, the full weight of his own behavior hitting him like a physical blow. Let you what, Kevin? I asked gently. Let you feel superior? Let you think you were the family success story? Let you make jokes about your broke older brother who couldn't make it in the civilian world? He set the check down on the coffee table with exaggerated care, as if it might explode if handled roughly. Why? He asked. And for the first time in years, he sounded like my little brother instead of my condescending younger sibling. Because I wanted to see if money changed how you treated me, I said. And for 8 years, you've treated me like a charity case while I was building something you couldn't imagine. You've patted my head and slipped me pocket money, and talked about how I should find a stable job, while I was employing 200 people and protecting national security infrastructure. Mom finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Marcus, honey, why didn't you tell us? I looked at her, this woman who'd worked herself to exhaustion trying to provide for us, and felt my resolve soften slightly. Because I wanted to know if you loved me for who I was, not what I could give you. And for 8 years, every time I came home, you treated me like the family disappointment who needed your help and sympathy. Dad cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the quiet conservatory. So what happens now? He asked. Do you want us to grovel? Do you want apologies? Do you want us to acknowledge that we were wrong about everything? I studied his face, looking for signs of the man who'd raised me, and realized I was seeing him clearly for the first time in years. I want Kevin to have his dream wedding, I said finally. I want you all to enjoy Willowbrook Manor, and remember this as the day our family celebrated something beautiful together. And after that, I want us to figure out how to have an honest relationship where nobody has to pretend to be something they're not. Kevin was still staring at the business card. Marcus, he said quietly. I'm sorry, for the phone call, for the assumptions, for all of it. I thought I knew who you were, and I was completely wrong. Jessica reached over and took his hand, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. We both were, she whispered. We all were. Mrs. Sinclair stood up with the help of her walking stick, surveying the family with the satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed exactly what she'd expected. Mr. Thompson, she said to me, this is precisely the kind of story that makes Willowbrook Manor special. Love, sacrifice, revelation, and ultimately reconciliation. Your wedding will indeed become part of this property's legacy. Victoria began gathering the paperwork with professional efficiency. I think we have everything we need for the final arrangements, she said. Kevin and Jessica, I'll call you tomorrow with the timeline for the weekend. Mr. Thompson, she addressed me directly. Thank you for making this possible. It's going to be an unforgettable celebration. As we prepared to leave the conservatory, Mom approached me with tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't say anything, just pulled me into a fierce hug that lasted for several minutes. When she finally stepped back, she looked up at me with eyes full of regret and pride and love. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. And I'm so sorry we didn't see it sooner. Dad's apology was more awkward, a handshake that turned into a brief hug, and a gruff admission that he'd misjudged everything. Kevin and Jessica walked out with me toward the parking area, both of them still processing the revelation that had turned their understanding of family dynamics upside down. Marcus, Kevin said as we reached our cars. I don't know how to process all of this. 2 hours ago, I thought I was the successful brother helping out his struggling older sibling. Now I find out you could buy and sell everything I own without blinking. It's going to take some time to wrap my head around it. Take all the time you need, I said. But Kevin, remember this feeling. Remember what it was like to discover that someone you thought you knew was actually someone completely different. Remember how it felt to realize you'd been making assumptions based on incomplete information. He nodded slowly, understanding the deeper lesson I was trying to teach. Will you stay for the wedding? Jessica asked. I mean, really stay, not just show up for the ceremony and leave. Stay for the whole celebration. Let us introduce you to our friends as the brother who made all of this possible. I looked back at Willowbrook Manor, its stone facade glowing in the late afternoon sunlight, and thought about the weekend ahead. I wouldn't miss it, I said. After all, it's not every day a family gets a chance to start over with complete honesty. Kevin smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him since he'd picked up that check. Then let's make it a celebration worth remembering, he said. Because apparently we have a lot to celebrate. As I drove back toward town in my rental Ford, I thought about the conversation that had just taken place, and the wedding that was still 5 days away. The hardest part was over, the revelation that had redefined everyone's understanding of who I was and what I'd accomplished. But the real test would be whether this new honesty could become the foundation for genuine relationships going forward. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. That went better than I expected. Your family's reaction was more graceful than most people would be in their situation. I typed back a quick response. They're good people who made bad assumptions. Now we get to find out what kind of relationship we can build with the truth. The next few days were going to be interesting, as Kevin and Jessica processed what they'd learned and prepared to get married in a venue that represented everything they thought they couldn't afford. But for the first time in 8 years, I was looking forward to a family celebration where I didn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't. The morning after the revelation at Willowbrook Manor, I woke up in my hotel room to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Word had apparently traveled fast through Cedar Falls, though I suspected most of the information was garbled and exaggerated. Small towns have a way of turning whispers into legends overnight, and by breakfast time, I was probably being described as everything from a secret millionaire, to a government spy, to a tech mogul who'd sold his soul to Silicon Valley. The first call I returned was to my assistant back in Austin. Marcus, she said before I could even say hello. I've had 12 reporters call this morning asking for interviews about your charitable donation to a military family. Apparently someone leaked the story to the local Iowa media, and now it's spreading on social media. I rubbed my temples, already feeling the headache that came with unwanted publicity. What kind of reporters? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Local news stations wanting a feel-good story about a successful veteran giving back to his community. A few military blogs picking up the angle about supporting fellow service members. And one particularly persistent journalist from Forbes, who seems to think this connects to a larger story about your company's growth and philanthropic activities. Kill all the interviews, I said firmly. Put out a statement that Mr. Thompson prefers to keep his private family matters private, and redirect any business inquiries to our normal media relations protocol. I'd spent years building Thompson Cyber Solutions while maintaining a relatively low profile, and I wasn't about to let Kevin's wedding turn me into a public figure. My second call was to Victoria, who sounded simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. Marcus, she said. I've been in event planning for 15 years, and yesterday was the most dramatic venue meeting I've ever witnessed. How are you holding up? Better than expected, I admitted. Though apparently the story's getting out, and I'm not thrilled about the attention. Victoria sighed. Kevin called me this morning. He's feeling guilty about the media interest, says he mentioned the situation to a few friends who must have talked to their friends. You know how these things spread. The good news is that Mrs. Sinclair is absolutely delighted by the whole story. She's already talking about featuring your family in the manor's historical documentation. That's the last thing I need, I said. But I suppose it's too late to worry about privacy now. Victoria agreed to handle any media inquiries related to the wedding planning, while I focused on managing the family dynamics that were still unfolding. Kevin had sent 3 apologetic text messages overnight, each one more self-recriminating than the last, while Jessica had written a long email thanking me for the generosity, while also expressing confusion about how she was supposed to act now that she knew the truth. Mom called while I was getting dressed, her voice still shaky from the emotional overload of the previous day. "Marcus, honey," she said. "I barely slept last night thinking about everything. I keep replaying conversations we've had over the years, things I said or didn't say, and I'm just sick about how we treated you." The guilt in her voice was almost unbearable. "Mom," I interrupted gently. "You don't need to torture yourself about the past. You did the best you could with the information you had. I chose not to tell you about the business, and that's on me, not you." But there was something else in her tone, something beyond simple regret, and I waited for her to get to the real reason for the call. "There's something I need to tell you," she said finally. "After we left yesterday, your father and I had a long talk, a really long talk, and he admitted something that I think you should know." She paused, gathering courage for whatever revelation was coming. "When you were in high school, when you were talking about joining the military because you couldn't afford college, your father had money set aside for your education. Not a lot, but enough for at least 2 years at the community college." I felt my chest tighten. "What happened to it?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "He spent it," Mom whispered, "on what he called investments, but they were really just bad bets. A friend's construction business that went under, some stock tips that didn't pan out, a piece of land that was supposed to be developed but never was. By the time you graduated, the money was gone, and he was too ashamed to admit it. So he let me join the military thinking I had no other options," I said slowly. "He let me believe that education was something our family couldn't afford, while he'd gambled away my college fund on schemes that never had a chance of working." Mom was crying now, soft sobs that carried 20 years of accumulated guilt and regret. "Marcus," she said, "he knows he failed you. We both do. And seeing what you've accomplished, knowing that you built this incredible success despite everything we didn't give you, it's overwhelming. We're proud of you, but we're also ashamed of ourselves, and we don't know how to balance those feelings." I sat down on the hotel bed, staring out the window at the Cedar Falls skyline, and thinking about alternate histories. What would have happened if I'd gone to college instead of the army? Would I have developed the discipline and technical skills that made Thomson Cyber Solutions possible? Would I have met the military contacts who became my first clients? Would I have learned to see opportunities where others saw obstacles? The truth was, Dad's failure might have been the best thing that ever happened to my career, but that didn't make it right. It didn't excuse the years of letting me struggle with guilt about not having a traditional college education, or the subtle ways he'd made me feel inferior for choosing a path he saw as second class. "Mom," I said finally, "I appreciate you telling me this. And I forgive Dad, even if he hasn't asked for forgiveness. But he needs to own his mistakes, not just feel bad about them." After we hung up, I decided to take a walk through downtown Cedar Falls, partly to clear my head, and partly to see how much the story had spread through the local community. The answer became clear when I stopped at the hardware store, where I'd worked summers during high school. The owner, Mr. Peterson, looked up from his inventory sheets and nearly dropped his clipboard. "Marcus Thompson," he said, his voice filled with amazement, "I heard about what you did for your brother's wedding. People are saying you wrote a $2 million check like it was nothing.
Word travels fast in small towns, I said, trying to keep my tone light. Mr. Peterson studied my face like he was seeing me for the first time. You know, he continued, I always wondered what happened to you after the army. Your parents would mention you occasionally, but they never seemed to know much about what you were doing. Now I understand why. You were building an empire while the rest of us were worried about quarterly sales reports. I wouldn't call it an empire, I said. Just a business that grew faster than I expected. But Mr. Peterson wasn't buying my modesty. He'd seen the local news coverage that morning, with reporters describing Thomson Cyber Solutions as one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity firms in the country. He'd heard the speculation about government contracts and classified projects, and the kind of wealth that most people in Cedar Falls couldn't even conceptualize. My next stop was the public library, where I'd spent countless hours researching colleges I couldn't afford and scholarship opportunities that never panned out. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, Jessica's aunt, recognized me immediately and approached with a mixture of excitement and curiosity. Marcus, she said, Jessica called me this morning with the most amazing news about the wedding venue. She says you're the one making it all possible. I tried to deflect with generalities about wanting to help family, but Mrs. Chen was too sharp to be put off easily. She'd been watching me since I was a teenager, had helped me with research projects and college applications, and had probably suspected that I was capable of more than anyone else in my family believed. Now she was seeing confirmation of instincts she'd had for 20 years. You were always different, she said, thoughtfully. More focused, more ambitious, more willing to work for what you wanted. I'm not surprised you succeeded, but I am surprised you kept it secret for so long. Why hide something you should be proud of? The question hit closer to home than I was comfortable with, partly because I wasn't entirely sure of the answer myself. I think I wanted to know if people valued me for who I was, not what I could provide. I said finally. And maybe I was afraid of changing the relationships I had, even if those relationships weren't entirely honest. Mrs. Chen nodded with the understanding of someone who'd spent decades watching families navigate success and failure, and all the complications that came with both. Your brother's wedding is going to be beautiful, she said. But the real gift isn't the venue or the money. It's the honesty. Families need truth to grow, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Her words stayed with me as I walked back toward the hotel, thinking about the wedding that was now just 3 days away, and all the conversations that still needed to happen. That afternoon, Kevin called and asked if I wanted to meet him at the golf course, where he'd been a member since landing his corporate job. It was the kind of place that represented everything he thought success looked like, with manicured greens and a clubhouse that served overpriced drinks to people who wanted to feel important. I agreed, partly because I was curious about his mindset, and partly because I thought neutral territory might make our
date conversation easier. Kevin was waiting at the first tee, dressed in golf clothes that probably cost more than most people spent on their entire wardrobe. He'd always been particular about appearances, especially in settings where he wanted to project success and status. But today, his usual confidence seemed forced, like he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else that he belonged in this environment. I brought you something, he said, reaching into his golf bag and withdrawing a familiar envelope. It was the $200 he'd given me at breakfast, the money he'd offered for gas and a new shirt. I want you to take this back, he continued. It feels wrong now, knowing what I know. It feels insulting. Keep it, I said, surprising him, not because I need it, but because it represents something important. For 24 hours you believed you were helping your struggling older brother, and that generosity mattered. The amount doesn't change the intent, and the intent was good. Kevin stared at the envelope for a moment before tucking it back into his pocket. We played 18 holes, though neither of us was particularly focused on the game. Kevin kept asking questions about the business, about how I'd transitioned from military service to entrepreneurship, about the specific contracts and clients that had built Thomson Cyber Solutions into what it was today. His curiosity was genuine, but I could also sense him trying to reconcile his assumptions about my life with the reality of what I'd accomplished. "The hardest part," he said as we approached the final hole, "is realizing how much I don't know about you. We're brothers, we grew up in the same house, and somehow I completely missed the fact that you were building something extraordinary. How does that happen? How do you become strangers with someone you're supposed to know better than anyone?" "I think we became strangers because we both needed to be different people than we actually were," I said, lining up my shot. "You needed to be the successful younger brother taking care of his struggling older sibling. I needed to be someone who didn't intimidate or complicate family relationships with inconvenient truths about money and success. We were both playing roles instead of being ourselves." Kevin's final shot landed in the sand trap and he laughed with more bitterness than humor. "Seems appropriate," he said. "I've been in a sand trap for years without realizing it. Making assumptions, playing the wrong game, measuring success by the wrong standards." His vulnerability was something I'd never seen from him before, and it made me realize how much pressure he'd been carrying to be the family's definition of achievement. After golf, we sat in the clubhouse bar, nursing drinks and continuing the conversation that had been building for days. Kevin talked about his corporate job, admitting for the first time that he found it mostly meaningless, a series of meetings and reports and performance reviews that generated revenue without creating anything lasting or important. He'd stayed because it provided security and status, but he'd never felt the sense of purpose that seemed to drive my work. "What you've built," he said, stirring his drink thoughtfully, "it matters. You're protecting national security, employing veterans, building something that makes a difference in the world. My job is optimizing supply chain logistics for a company that makes plastic containers. We move numbers around spreadsheets and call it success." "There's nothing wrong with honest work," I said, "and there's nothing wrong with choosing security and stability. But Kevin, you don't have to stay in a job that doesn't fulfill you just because it looks successful to other people. You've got skills and intelligence and connections. If you wanted to do something different, something that mattered to you, there are ways to make that happen." "Like what?" he asked. "Start my own business. Join the military at 32. Go back to school and become a teacher or a social worker." Kevin's questions revealed a deeper frustration, a sense that he'd chosen a path early in life and now felt trapped by the expectations and obligations that came with it. His wedding was supposed to be a celebration of the life he'd built, but instead it was highlighting all the ways he felt unfulfilled and uncertain about his choices. "Like figuring out what you actually want instead of what you think you're supposed to want," I said. "The money I spent on your wedding isn't important to me because I have more money than I can spend in a lifetime. But if it helps you and Jessica start your marriage with a clear understanding of what matters to you both, then it's worth every penny." We finished our drinks in comfortable silence, both of us processing the weight of honesty that had become the foundation of our renewed relationship. Kevin seemed lighter somehow, as if admitting his dissatisfaction had lifted a burden he'd been carrying for years. And for the first time since I'd returned to Cedar Falls, I felt like I was talking to my actual brother instead of the persona he thought he needed to project. That evening, Jessica called and asked if I'd meet her for coffee, just the two of us. She'd been quiet during most of the family conversations, observing the dynamics between Kevin and me, while processing her own reactions to the revelations about my success. I was curious about her perspective, partly because she was the only family member who hadn't known me before my transformation, and partly because her relationship with Kevin was going to be affected by everything that had changed. We met at a coffee shop downtown, one of those trendy places that had opened since I'd left Cedar Falls. catering to young professionals who wanted to feel sophisticated while still living in a small Iowa town. Jessica arrived looking thoughtful and slightly nervous, carrying a notebook that suggested she'd prepared for this conversation more carefully than I'd expected. "Marcus," she began, stirring sugar into her latte, "I've been thinking about everything that happened yesterday, and I need to understand something. Why now? Why reveal everything right before the wedding instead of waiting until afterward, or keeping it secret indefinitely?" Her question was more perceptive than I'd anticipated, cutting straight to the motivations I was still sorting through myself. "Honestly," I said, "I think Kevin's drunk phone call pushed me past a breaking point I didn't know I was approaching. Hearing him mock my military service, dismiss my struggles, assume I was too poor to afford basic travel expenses, it crystallized something that had been building for years. I realized I was tired of being invisible, tired of being underestimated, tired of relationships based on false assumptions." Jessica nodded, making notes in her notebook like she was conducting an interview. "But the timing," she pressed. "Right before our wedding, when emotions are already running high, and we're dealing with enough stress and logistics. Couldn't this have waited until afterward?" Her concern was valid, and I appreciated her directness in addressing it. "The venue fire created an opportunity," I admitted, "a chance to do something meaningful for Kevin while also forcing a conversation that was overdue. If I'd waited until after the wedding, the moment would have passed, and we'd all have gone back to our established patterns of interaction. Sometimes disruption is necessary for growth." Jessica was quiet for several minutes, processing my explanation while reviewing whatever notes she'd made in preparation for this conversation. When she looked up, her expression was more serious than I'd ever seen from her. "Marcus," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is this about revenge? Are you punishing Kevin for years of condescension by forcing him to accept your generosity? Because if that's what this is, I need to know before I marry him." Her question hit me like a physical blow, partly because it was so direct, and partly because I wasn't entirely sure of the answer myself. Was there an element of revenge in what I'd done? Had I orchestrated the revelation at Willowbrook Manor because I wanted Kevin to feel small and foolish and wrong about everything he'd believed about our relative success? "I think," I said slowly, "that there might be some truth to that. I won't pretend I didn't enjoy seeing Kevin's face when he realized what the signature on that check meant. I won't pretend I didn't take satisfaction in proving that his assumptions about me were completely wrong. But Jessica, if revenge was my primary motivation, I could have humiliated him much more effectively and much more publicly." She leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the intensity of someone making a critical decision about her future. "What I'm trying to understand," she continued, "is whether this revelation changes Kevin's relationship with you in a positive way, or whether it just shifts the power dynamic without actually improving anything meaningful between you." "That's a fair question," I said, "and honestly, I don't know the answer yet. The next few days will probably tell us whether Kevin can accept that his older brother is successful without feeling diminished by it, and whether I can accept his apologies without holding on to resentment about years of being treated like a charity case." Jessica made more notes, then closed her notebook and looked at me directly. "I love Kevin," she said, "but I've also seen how he treats people he considers beneath him, and I've always wondered what that said about his character. Yesterday, watching him realize he'd been wrong about you, I saw humility from him that I'd never seen before. If this experience makes him more aware of his assumptions and more respectful of people regardless of their apparent status, then maybe it's the best wedding gift you could have given us." Her insight surprised me, partly because it suggested she'd been observing Kevin's behavior more critically than I'd realized, and partly because she was framing the situation as an opportunity for growth, rather than just a source of family drama. We talked for another hour about the wedding logistics, about how she and Kevin were processing the venue change and the financial implications they still didn't fully understand. As we prepared to leave, Jessica asked one final question. "Marcus," she said, "after the wedding, after all the excitement and media attention dies down, what kind of relationship do you want with Kevin and with the rest of your family? Do you want to be involved in our lives, or was this a dramatic way of saying goodbye?" "I want to be the kind of brother who doesn't have to hide who he is," I said. "I want relationships based on truth rather than comfortable assumptions. Whether that's possible, whether we can build something real and honest after years of performance and pretense, I honestly don't know. But I'm willing to try if you all are." The wedding was now just 2 days away, and I was beginning to understand that the ceremony itself would be less important than the conversations that had led up to it. The venue change, the financial revelation, the family dynamics that had been exposed and examined, all of it was creating a foundation for relationships that might actually be worth maintaining. But first, we had to get through a wedding at Willowbrook Manor, with all the complexity and emotion that was going to come with celebrating Kevin and Jessica's marriage in a place that represented everything my family thought they couldn't afford, paid for by the brother they'd never really understood. 2 days, to see if honesty could actually bring us closer together, or if the truth was just going to make it impossible to pretend we were a family anymore. The wedding day arrived with the kind of perfect Iowa weather that makes you believe the universe occasionally aligns for special occasions. Clear blue skies, gentle breeze, temperatures in the mid-70s, everything exactly as ordered for an outdoor ceremony at Willowbrook Manor. I'd upgraded my hotel room to a suite the night before, partly for comfort but mostly because I knew I'd need space to prepare for what was likely to be the most emotionally complex day of my adult life. My phone was buzzing constantly with messages from business partners and employees who'd seen the media coverage about the wedding donation. The story had grown beyond local Iowa news, picked up by military blogs and business publications, who were fascinated by the angle of a successful veteran supporting his family in such a dramatic fashion. I'd instructed my assistant to handle all media inquiries with standard no-comment responses, but the attention was becoming difficult to ignore. The most surprising message came from General Patricia Martinez, my former commanding officer from Fort Carson, who'd tracked down my personal number to congratulate me on both the business success and the family gesture. "Marcus," her text read, "always knew you had the potential for something special. The way you're honoring your brother shows the same leadership qualities that made you exceptional in the Signal Corps. Proud to have served with you." That message meant more to me than any of the business coverage or media attention, because General Martinez had been the one who'd encouraged me to think beyond military service, to see my technical skills as the foundation for something larger. She'd written one of the recommendation letters that helped me land my first government contract, and her belief in my potential had sustained me through the early challenges of building Thomson Cyber Solutions. I arrived at Willowbrook Manor 3 hours before the ceremony, partly to ensure everything was progressing smoothly, but mostly to have time alone with the magnitude of what I'd set in motion. The grounds were already transformed, with white chairs arranged in perfect rows facing an arbor draped in flowers that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. A string quartet was rehearsing near the gardens, and catering staff moved with the efficient precision of people who specialized in events where everything had to be flawless. Victoria found me on the terrace overlooking the Iowa River, reviewing final details on her tablet with the focused intensity that had made her one of the most sought-after wedding planners in the Midwest. "Marcus," she said, settling into the chair beside me, "everything's running on schedule. The photographer arrived early, and is already capturing preparation shots. The florist finished the ceremony arrangements, and Mrs. Sinclair is personally overseeing the reception setup in the ballroom. How are Kevin and Jessica holding up?" I asked, realizing I hadn't spoken to either of them since my coffee conversation with Jessica 2 days earlier. Victoria smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning was coming together perfectly. They're both nervous but excited. Kevin keeps asking if there's anything he should be doing to help, and Jessica spent an hour this morning writing thank you notes for family members to sign. They're good people, Marcus. Whatever else has happened between you all, they genuinely appreciate what you've done. I nodded, watching the catering staff arrange tables that looked like something from a European palace. The total cost of this wedding had grown to nearly $500,000, a number that would have seemed impossible to my family just a week earlier, but represented less than 10 days of revenue for Thomson Cyber Solutions. The disparity still amazed me, not because of the money itself, but because of how completely my family had misunderstood the trajectory of my life since leaving the military. Mrs. Sinclair appeared on the terrace, moving slowly but purposefully with her elegant walking stick, dressed in a navy blue ensemble that probably cost more than most people's formal wear collections. "Mr. Thompson," she said, settling into a chair with the careful dignity of someone who'd spent 93 years perfecting the art of gracious hosting. "I wanted to speak with you before the festivities begin." "Of course," I said, curious about what she wanted to discuss. Mrs. Sinclair studied my face with the sharp intelligence that had made her a legendary figure in Iowa society for more than 7 decades. She'd built her reputation on reading people accurately, on understanding motivations and character in ways that allowed her to navigate complex social situations with perfect instincts. "In my years of hosting events at Willowbrook Manor," she began, "I've witnessed many celebrations that revealed more about families than anyone expected. Weddings have a way of bringing underlying dynamics to the surface, for better or worse. Your situation is particularly fascinating because you've used this occasion to fundamentally alter your family's understanding of who you are and what you've accomplished." I waited, sensing she had more to say. Mrs. Sinclair continued, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood the weight of language. "What impresses me most is not the financial generosity, though that's certainly remarkable. What impresses me is your willingness to risk comfortable relationships for the possibility of honest ones. Many people spend their entire lives avoiding that kind of vulnerability." She paused, watching a groundskeeper make final adjustments to the flower arrangements. "The question," she continued, "is whether your family can handle the truth you've given them. Some people prefer comfortable illusions to uncomfortable realities, and forcing them to confront their assumptions can create resentment rather than understanding." "That's what I'm afraid of," I admitted. "Part of me wonders if I should have kept things simple, let Kevin have his wedding without complicating it with revelations about my success. Maybe maintaining the status quo would have been kinder to everyone involved." Mrs. Sinclair shook her head with the firmness of someone who'd spent decades observing human nature. "Kindness without honesty isn't really kindness," she said, "it's enabling. Your family needed to know who you really are, and you needed to stop pretending to be someone you're not. The wedding simply provided the catalyst for overdue truth-telling. Whatever happens next, at least it will be based on reality rather than assumptions." An hour later, guests began arriving in a procession of cars that ranged from practical Iowa sedans to a few luxury vehicles that suggested Jessica's extended family included some people with serious money. I positioned myself near the entrance, greeting people I'd known since childhood, and watching their reactions when they realized I was the anonymous benefactor who'd made this elaborate celebration possible. The responses varied from amazement to confusion to barely concealed envy, but most people seemed genuinely happy that Kevin and Jessica were having their dream wedding, regardless of how it had been financed. Peterson from the hardware store shook my hand with the enthusiasm of someone who'd always believed I was capable of more than anyone else realized. Several of my high school teachers approached with congratulations that felt more like vindication of their early faith in my potential. The most awkward moment came when Dale Morrison, Kevin's best man and closest friend since college, pulled me aside for a conversation that was clearly motivated by curiosity rather than courtesy.
Marcus, he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who thought he was entitled to inside information. Kevin told me about your business, but he was pretty vague about the details. What exactly do you do that generates this kind of money? I gave him the standard response about cybersecurity consulting and government contracts, but Dale pressed for specifics with the persistence of someone who couldn't quite believe the story he'd been told. It's just hard to picture, he continued. Kevin's been talking about you as the brother who never really found his footing after the military, and now suddenly you're writing million-dollar checks like it's nothing. That's quite a transformation. His skepticism was understandable but irritating, partly because it reflected the same assumptions that had motivated Kevin's condescending behavior for years. People find it easier to believe in dramatic failure than dramatic success, especially when that success challenges their understanding of how the world works. I kept my response brief and professional, but I could see Dale filing away the interaction for future analysis and gossip. Kevin appeared 30 minutes before the ceremony, looking nervous but genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen from him since we were teenagers. His tuxedo fit perfectly, probably custom-tailored for the occasion, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew he was about to marry exactly the right person. When he saw me, his expression shifted to something more complex, gratitude mixed with residual embarrassment about years of misunderstanding. Marcus, he said, approaching with the careful formality of someone who was still processing a fundamental shift in family dynamics. I wanted to talk to you before everything gets crazy with the ceremony. I know I've said this already, but I need to say it again. Thank you. Not just for the money, though obviously that's incredible, but for caring enough about my happiness to make this possible. You don't need to keep thanking me, I said. You're my brother. This is what family should do for each other when they're able. Kevin nodded, but I could see him working through something else, some additional thought that was making him uncomfortable. Finally, he found the words he'd been searching for. The thing is, he continued, I keep thinking about all the times I offered to help you, all the little gestures I thought were so generous. $20 for gas, suggestions about job hunting, advice about finding something stable and secure. And now I realize how condescending that must have felt, knowing what you'd actually built. I was trying to be the successful younger brother taking care of his struggling older sibling, and the whole time you were operating on a level I couldn't even comprehend. His honesty was more painful than any of his previous assumptions had been, because it forced both of us to confront the full scope of how wrong our relationship had been for years. But it also offered the possibility of something better, something based on mutual respect rather than misplaced pity. Kevin, I said, we both made mistakes. I should have been honest about my success instead of letting you make assumptions. You should have asked more questions instead of deciding you knew everything about my life. We can't change the past, but we can do better going forward. The conversation was interrupted by Victoria, who appeared with the efficient urgency of someone managing a complex timeline. Kevin, she said, it's time for final preparations. The officiant wants to review the ceremony order, and Jessica's getting ready for her entrance. Marcus, she turned to me, Mrs. Sinclair has reserved a seat for you in the front row, family section. Your parents are already seated. I walked toward the ceremony area, passing through gardens that looked like something from a European fairy tale. The late afternoon sunlight was perfect, casting everything in the golden glow that photographers spend their careers trying to capture. Guest seating was nearly full, with about 150 people representing Kevin and Jessica's combined social circles, extended families, and professional relationships. Mom and Dad were sitting in the front row, both dressed in their finest clothes and looking slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding them. Dad wore the same suit he'd worn to Kevin's college graduation, altered slightly to accommodate the weight he'd gained in recent years, while Mom had purchased a new dress specifically for the occasion, something elegant but conservative that reflected her lifelong approach to special events. When I joined them, Mom immediately grabbed my hand with the intensity of someone who needed physical connection to process overwhelming emotions. Marcus, She whispered, "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. The flowers, the music, the setting, everything is perfect. Jessica's going to feel like a princess walking down that aisle." Dad's reaction was more reserved but equally genuine. He kept looking around at the other guests, at the professional photography equipment, at the level of coordination and expense that had created this celebration. "Son," he said quietly, "I'm still trying to understand how you managed all this. The venue, the planning, the money, it's more than I ever imagined possible for any of us." That comment highlighted something I'd been thinking about throughout the weekend. My family's limited expectations hadn't just affected their understanding of my potential, they'd also constrained their understanding of what was possible for Kevin and Jessica. The wedding they'd originally planned had been nice but modest, appropriate for a young couple with middle-class jobs and reasonable financial expectations. But the celebration that was about to begin represented something they'd never allowed themselves to dream about. The string quartet shifted to the processional music, and conversations throughout the seating area gradually quieted as everyone turned toward the back of the ceremony space. The bridal party began their entrance, with Jessica's bridesmaids and Kevin's groomsmen walking in carefully choreographed pairs toward the arbor, where the officiant waited with Kevin. Jessica appeared at the end of the pathway, accompanied by her father, wearing a dress that belonged in magazines dedicated to luxury weddings. The entire scene looked like something from a movie, with professional lighting and photography capturing every moment for posterity. But what struck me most was the expression on Kevin's face as he watched his bride approach. Pure joy, unmixed with the anxiety or doubt that sometimes shadows wedding ceremonies. The ceremony itself was traditional but personalized, with vows that Jessica and Kevin had written themselves, incorporating references to their shared dreams and commitment to building a life together. When they exchanged rings, I found myself thinking about partnership and honesty, and the foundation necessary for relationships that could withstand the challenges that inevitably come with time and change. The officiant pronounced them married just as the late afternoon sun was beginning to set over the Iowa River, creating the kind of magical lighting that would make their wedding photos legendary. The reception moved seamlessly to Willowbrook Manor's ballroom, a space that had hosted railroad barons and industrial magnates and political figures throughout its century of existence. Dinner was served at tables arranged around a dance floor that gleamed under crystal chandeliers, with centerpieces that represented weeks of planning and thousands of dollars in exotic flowers. The meal itself was prepared by one of the most exclusive catering companies in the Midwest, featuring courses that showcased seasonal Iowa ingredients elevated to restaurant-quality sophistication. During dinner, Kevin stood to make a toast that I knew was going to address the unusual circumstances surrounding their wedding celebration. He'd mentioned wanting to acknowledge the anonymous foundation publicly, partly out of gratitude, but also because avoiding the topic entirely would have seemed strange to guests who knew about the venue change and financial sponsorship. "Friends and family," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's excellent acoustics. "Jessica and I want to thank everyone for joining us at this incredible venue for what has been the most perfect wedding we could have imagined. Many of you know that we received unexpected support from what we thought was a charitable foundation, allowing us to celebrate here at Willowbrook Manor instead of our original plans." He paused, looking directly at me with an expression that combined gratitude, regret, and something approaching awe. "What you don't know," he continued, "is that the foundation doesn't exist. The generosity that made this celebration possible came from my brother Marcus, who built a successful cybersecurity company after leaving military service, and decided that Jessica and I deserved to start our marriage with something extraordinary." The murmur that went through the room was immediate and intense, as guests processed this information and began connecting it to conversations they'd had throughout the evening about my transformation from struggling veteran to successful entrepreneur. Kevin continued, his voice becoming more emotional as he spoke. "For years," he said, "I thought I knew who my brother was and what he'd accomplished with his life. I was wrong about almost everything, and my assumptions led me to treat him in ways that I'm not proud of. Marcus could have
corrected my misunderstandings at any time, but instead he chose to let me believe what I wanted to believe while he quietly built something amazing. The generosity he's shown Jessica and me isn't just financial, though the financial support has been life-changing. The real gift is the opportunity to start our marriage with complete honesty about who we are and what we mean to each other. Marcus has taught us that assumptions can be dangerous, that real relationships require truth even when truth is uncomfortable, and that family love should be based on understanding rather than convenience. Kevin raised his glass toward me, his eyes bright with tears he wasn't trying to hide. To my brother Marcus, he said, who gave us the perfect wedding and the perfect lesson about the difference between success and significance. Thank you for caring enough about our happiness to risk changing everything between us. The applause was sustained and genuine, with many guests standing to acknowledge both Kevin's toast and the revelation about my role in creating their celebration. I stood briefly to acknowledge the recognition, but I kept my response simple and focused on Kevin and Jessica rather than my own story. "This day belongs to you both," I said. "I'm just grateful I could be part of making it perfect." The dancing that followed felt different from typical wedding receptions, partly because of the elegant setting but mostly because of the emotional complexity that had been acknowledged and processed throughout the evening. Kevin and Jessica's first dance was performed to live music from a jazz trio I'd arranged as a surprise addition to the original plans, and their obvious happiness created the kind of romantic atmosphere that made everyone feel privileged to witness their commitment. Later in the evening, as the celebration began winding down and guests started making their departure plans, Dad approached me for the most substantial conversation we'd had since my revelation at the venue meeting. "Marcus," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of accumulated regret, "I need to apologize to you, not just for the assumptions I made about your success, but for the ways I failed you long before that." I waited, sensing he had more to say. "Your mother told you about the college money," he continued, "the fund I was supposed to preserve for your education. Losing that money was the biggest mistake of my life, not because of the financial impact, but because it forced you to make choices you shouldn't have had to make. You joined the military because I failed to provide alternatives, and then I compounded that failure by treating your service like it was somehow less valuable than traditional college education." Dad's honesty was more than I'd expected, and more than I'd thought possible from someone who'd spent decades avoiding responsibility for his mistakes. But his willingness to acknowledge the full scope of his failures created an opportunity for genuine reconciliation rather than polite forgiveness. "Dad," I said, "the military turned out to be exactly what I needed, even if it wasn't what any of us planned. The technical training, the discipline, the leadership experience, all of it contributed to the success I've built. Maybe your mistake turned into my opportunity." He shook his head with the firmness of someone who wouldn't be absolved so easily. "That's generous of you to say, but it doesn't change the fact that I let you down when you needed me most. What I want you to know is that watching you succeed despite my failures has been the most humbling experience of my life. You became the man I always hoped you'd become, but you did it without the support you deserved from your father." Our conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Sinclair, who approached with the satisfaction of someone whose event had exceeded even her exacting standards. "Hey, Mr. Thompson," she said, addressing both my father and me, "this has been one of the most meaningful celebrations Willowbrook Manor has ever hosted. The combination of genuine love, family reconciliation, and generous support has created exactly the kind of legacy that makes this property special." She turned to me specifically. "Your donation will be remembered as one of the most significant gestures in our history, not because of the amount involved, but because of the healing it facilitated. Families need truth to grow, and you provided that truth in the most loving way possible." As the evening wound down and the last guests made their departures, I found myself alone on the terrace where I'd started the day, looking out at the Iowa River under a sky full of stars. The wedding had been everything I'd hoped it would be, a celebration that honored Kevin and Jessica's love, while also creating space for honest relationships based on mutual understanding rather than comfortable assumptions. Victoria joined me for a final debriefing, carrying a folder of photographs that the wedding photographer had printed as immediate keepsakes. "Marcus," she said, settling into the chair beside me, "I've coordinated hundreds of weddings, but I've never seen anything quite like this." The combination of family drama, financial revelation, and genuine reconciliation created something that transcended typical celebration. She showed me several photographs from throughout the evening, images that captured not just the beauty of the venue and the elegance of the celebration, but the emotional journey that had brought us all to this point. Kevin and Jessica exchanging vows, Mom crying during the ceremony, Dad's proud smile during the toasts, and family photographs that showed relationships transformed by honesty. "Do you think it was worth it?" she asked. "The complexity, the risk, the media attention, all of it." I looked at the photographs for several minutes, thinking about the conversations that had led to this celebration and the relationships that would grow from this foundation of truth. "Ask me in 5 years," I said finally. "Right now, I'm optimistic that we've built something better than what we had before. But the real test will be whether we can maintain these honest relationships when the excitement of the wedding fades, and we're back to navigating ordinary family dynamics." Victoria gathered her materials and prepared to conclude her longest and most complex wedding coordination project in years. "Whatever happens," she said, "you've given Kevin and Jessica a celebration they'll remember forever, and you've given your family a chance to know who you really are. That's more than most people manage in a lifetime." After she left, I remained on the terrace for another hour, processing the day's events and thinking about the future of relationships that had been fundamentally altered by truth and generosity. The wedding had accomplished everything I'd hoped for and revealed dynamics I hadn't expected, creating possibilities for genuine connection that hadn't existed when I'd arrived in Cedar Falls a week earlier. My phone buzzed with a text from Kevin, sent from whatever honeymoon suite he and Jessica were spending their wedding night in at a luxury hotel in downtown Cedar Falls. "Marcus," the message read, "thank you for giving us the perfect beginning to our marriage and the perfect lesson about family love. We'll never forget what you've done, and we'll never take you for granted again." I smiled, looking up at the Iowa stars and thinking about second chances and honest relationships and the kind of success that actually matters. The wedding was over, but the real celebration was just beginning. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to going home for Christmas. 6 months after the wedding, I received a phone call that changed everything again. This time it wasn't from family. It wasn't about assumptions or revelations or hidden truths. It was from the Pentagon, and the voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Sarah Mitchell, someone I'd worked with on classified projects but had never met in person. "Marcus," she said, her tone carrying the kind of urgency that indicated this wasn't a routine business call. "I'm calling about a situation that requires your immediate attention. We've had a significant breach in our Eastern European intelligence network, and preliminary analysis suggests the attack vector was through cybersecurity vulnerabilities that your company was contracted to prevent." I felt my stomach drop as I processed what she was telling me. Thomson Cyber Solutions had built its reputation on preventing exactly this kind of catastrophic failure, and if our security protocols had been compromised, it represented not just a business disaster but a potential national security crisis. "How significant is the breach?" I asked, already mentally preparing for the crisis management protocols I'd hoped never to use. "Significant enough that 3 intelligence officers are currently in hiding, and 2 planned operations have been completely compromised," Colonel Mitchell replied. "We need you in Washington within 12 hours for a full briefing, and we need your best team ready for immediate deployment. This is classified at the highest levels, Marcus. We're talking about potential loss of life if we can't contain the damage quickly. I hung up and immediately called my crisis management team, pulling key personnel from vacation and weekend plans to assemble at our Austin headquarters within 2 hours. The next several hours became a blur of technical analysis, secure communications, and the kind of high-stakes problem-solving that reminded me why I'd built Thomson Cyber Solutions in the first place. We weren't just a business, we were a critical component of national security infrastructure. The flight to Washington was on a military transport, the kind of no-frills travel that took me back to my Army days. But instead of carrying a rifle and basic equipment, I was carrying encrypted laptops and access codes that could potentially save lives or, if mishandled, make the crisis exponentially worse. The responsibility felt heavier than anything I'd carried in uniform. The Pentagon briefing room was filled with people whose names I recognized from intelligence reports but had never expected to meet in person. Deputy directors, senior analysts, field operatives who'd been extracted from compromised positions, all of them looking to my team for solutions to problems that were spiraling beyond anyone's control. The technical details were complex, but the core issue was straightforward. Someone had exploited a vulnerability in our security architecture that should have been impossible to breach, suggesting either an inside knowledge that was deeply concerning or a level of technical sophistication that exceeded our threat assessments. My team worked for 72 hours straight, rebuilding security protocols and tracing attack vectors, while intelligence officers waited to learn whether they could safely return to their assignments. When we finally isolated and neutralized the breach, the relief in that Pentagon conference room was palpable. But the experience had shaken my confidence in ways that years of business success hadn't prepared me for. I'd built Thomson Cyber Solutions on the premise that we could protect critical infrastructure from the most sophisticated threats imaginable, and we'd come uncomfortably close to catastrophic failure. Flying back to Austin, I found myself thinking about success and responsibility and the weight that comes with being genuinely good at something that matters. The wedding revelation had been about family relationships and honest communication, but this Pentagon crisis was about the life or death consequences of the work I'd chosen to build my career around. Kevin called while I was still processing the emotional aftermath of the Washington trip, though I obviously couldn't discuss any details of what had happened. His voice sounded different, lighter somehow, and I realized he was calling from a place of genuine happiness rather than obligation or family duty. "Marcus," he said, "I wanted to give you an update on something Jessica and I have been working on since the wedding. We've been talking about what we learned from your generosity, about the difference between comfortable assumptions and uncomfortable truths, and we've decided to make some major changes in our lives." "I'm listening," I said, curious about what kind of changes he was referring to. Kevin had seemed content with his corporate job and middle-class lifestyle, so any significant alterations would represent a fundamental shift in his priorities and goals. "I quit my job," he announced, his voice carrying excitement rather than anxiety about what most people would consider a terrifying decision. "The corporate logistics thing was making me miserable, and after watching you build something meaningful from nothing, I realized I was wasting time in a career that didn't matter to me or anyone else." "That's a big step," I said carefully. "What are you planning to do instead?" Kevin's laugh was more confident than I'd heard from him since we were teenagers, when he still believed anything was possible and hadn't yet learned to settle for safe choices. "Jessica and I are starting a nonprofit organization focused on supporting military families during the transition back to civilian life," he said. "We want to provide resources for job training, mental health support, financial planning, all the things that you probably could have used when you left the Army but had to figure out on your own." The irony wasn't lost on me that Kevin was now dedicating his career to helping veterans navigate challenges that I'd overcome through determination and luck rather than systematic support.
But more importantly, his decision represented exactly the kind of honest self-assessment that our wedding conversations had been designed to encourage. "We're calling it the Thompson Foundation," he continued, "in honor of what you taught us about family and sacrifice, and the responsibility that comes with success. Obviously, we'll need significant funding to make it viable, and I was hoping you might be interested in serving as our primary sponsor." Kevin's request caught me off guard, not because it was inappropriate but because it represented such a complete reversal of our historical relationship dynamic. Instead of asking for help with personal expenses or small family emergencies, he was proposing a partnership around work that would directly address issues I cared deeply about. "Send me a business plan," I said. "If the concept is sound and the execution strategy is realistic, Thomson Cyber Solutions would be honored to provide initial funding and ongoing support. But Kevin, I want this to succeed because it's well designed and properly managed, not just because we're brothers." That conversation marked the beginning of a collaboration that transformed our relationship more completely than the wedding revelation had. Over the following months, Kevin and Jessica developed a comprehensive approach to veteran transition support that impressed military officials, nonprofit experts, and potential corporate sponsors. Their combination of genuine passion and systematic planning created exactly the kind of initiative that could make a meaningful difference in people's lives. The Thompson Foundation's first office opened in a renovated building in downtown Cedar Falls, with satellite locations planned for other military communities throughout Iowa and neighboring states. Kevin threw himself into the work with an energy I'd never seen from him during his corporate career, while Jessica's background in social work provided the expertise necessary to design effective support programs. Mom became one of their first volunteers, using her decades of customer service experience to help military spouses navigate employment opportunities in civilian careers. Dad, surprising everyone including himself, volunteered to teach financial literacy classes, drawing on hard-earned lessons about budgeting and avoiding the kind of investment mistakes that had cost our family my college fund years earlier. The Foundation's first major success story was an Army sergeant named David Rodriguez, who'd left active duty with specialized technical training but no clear path toward civilian employment. Kevin's program connected him with certification courses, interview preparation, and ultimately a position with a defense contractor that valued his military experience rather than seeing it as irrelevant to civilian work. David's transformation reminded me of my own transition from the Army to entrepreneurship, except he had systematic support instead of having to figure everything out through trial and error. Watching him succeed validated Kevin's decision to leave his comfortable corporate job for work that actually mattered to him. The media attention around the Thompson Foundation was different from the coverage of Kevin's wedding, focused on impact rather than family drama. Business journals wrote about the innovative approach to veteran support, military publications highlighted the program's effectiveness, and local Iowa media celebrated Kevin and Jessica's commitment to serving their community. But the most meaningful recognition came from General Martinez, who visited the Cedar Falls office during a Midwest tour and spent several hours reviewing the Foundation's programs and outcomes. "Kevin," she said during her public remarks that afternoon, "you and Jessica have created exactly the kind of comprehensive support system that should have existed for decades. This is how we honor military service, by ensuring that the transition to civilian success is systematic rather than accidental." That evening, General Martinez had dinner with my family at Miller's Breakfast Nook, the same diner where Kevin and I had met for coffee before his wedding revelation. The contrast between that awkward conversation and this celebration of meaningful work accomplished together highlighted how much our relationships had evolved. "Marcus," she said, addressing me directly while Kevin and Jessica listened with obvious pride. "What you've built with Thompson Cyber Solutions is impressive, but what your brother has built with your support is transformational. The combination of your business success and his program implementation is creating opportunities for veterans that wouldn't exist otherwise. 6 months later, I received another call from the Pentagon, but this time, it was an invitation rather than a crisis. Colonel Mitchell wanted Thomson Cyber Solutions to present our enhanced security protocols to a gathering of defense contractors, intelligence officials, and military technology specialists. The breach that had nearly caused catastrophic damage had led to innovations that were now being adopted across multiple agencies. The presentation went well, but the most satisfying moment came during the networking reception afterward, when I was approached by a young Army captain named Lisa Chen, who was transitioning out of active duty and looking for career opportunities in cybersecurity. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "I've been following your company's work and your family's foundation, and I wanted to thank you for creating pathways for people like me. The Thomson Foundation connected me with technical certification programs, and Thomson Cyber Solutions offered me an internship that starts next month. Without those opportunities, I'd be struggling to figure out civilian career transition on my own." Captain Chen's gratitude reminded me of the larger purpose behind both the business I'd built and the foundation Kevin had created with my support. We weren't just generating revenue or providing services, we were creating systematic solutions to problems that affected people's lives in fundamental ways. The flight back to Austin gave me time to reflect on the journey that had started with Kevin's drunk phone call and evolved into a family business partnership focused on supporting military veterans. The wedding revelation had been about honesty and relationships, but the foundation represented something more substantial, a shared commitment to work that mattered beyond personal success or family dynamics. That weekend, I drove out to the Hill Country Ranch that was finally nearing completion, a 1,000-acre property with views that stretched to the horizon and space for the kind of quiet reflection that had become increasingly important as Thomson Cyber Solutions grew larger and more complex. The main house was designed for entertaining, with guest rooms that could accommodate family visits and office space where I could work when I needed isolation from the Austin headquarters. But the most important feature was a conference center where the Thomson Foundation could hold retreats and training programs, bringing military families to Texas for intensive support services that couldn't be provided in smaller Iowa locations. Kevin and Jessica had spent weeks planning the facility's layout and programming, designing something that would complement their Cedar Falls operation while expanding their capacity to serve veterans from across the country. The first Thomson Foundation retreat was scheduled for the following month, with 20 military families participating in a week-long program covering job training, financial planning, mental health support, and family counseling. Kevin had recruited instructors from universities, corporations, and nonprofit organizations throughout Texas, creating a comprehensive curriculum that addressed every aspect of civilian transition. I spent the evening before the retreat walking through the conference center, reviewing final preparations, and thinking about the path that had brought us from family dysfunction to meaningful collaboration. The facility represented everything I'd hoped our relationships could become: honest communication directed toward purposes larger than personal comfort or conventional success. The retreat exceeded everyone's expectations, with participating families forming connections and support networks that extended far beyond the formal programming. Kevin's leadership during the week reminded me of the best aspects of his personality, the charm and empathy that had made him popular throughout his life, but were now directed toward genuinely important work. On the final evening, we gathered around a fire pit on the ranch's main terrace, with military families sharing stories about their transitions and future plans. The conversation was informal but profound, touching on themes of service, sacrifice, community, and the challenge of finding purpose in civilian careers after military experience. One participant, a Marine veteran named James Wilson, spoke about the isolation he'd felt after leaving active duty, the sense that civilian employers didn't understand or value his military training. The Thompson Foundation's program had connected him not just with job opportunities, but with a community of veterans facing similar challenges. "Mr. Thompson," he said, addressing both Kevin and me, "what you've created here isn't just career counseling or financial planning. It's a recognition that military service creates bonds and responsibilities that don't end when you take off the uniform. This program honors that service by ensuring that veterans succeed in civilian life." His words captured something essential about what Kevin and I had built together, a partnership that honored both military service and family relationships while creating practical solutions to problems that affected people's lives. The foundation was successful because it addressed real needs with systematic approaches, but it was meaningful because it grew out of honest relationships and shared values. The retreat concluded with a ceremony recognizing the participating families and their commitments to supporting other veterans in their home communities. Kevin and Jessica presented certificates that acknowledged their week of intensive training, but more importantly, they established ongoing mentorship relationships that would continue long after everyone returned home. Driving back to Austin that evening, I realized that Kevin's wedding had been just the beginning of a transformation that was still unfolding. The financial revelation had forced honest conversations about assumptions and relationships, but the foundation represented something more lasting, a shared commitment to work that would outlive both of us. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom, who had attended the entire retreat and helped coordinate family support services throughout the week. "Marcus and Kevin," she wrote, "watching you work together this week has been the proudest moment of my life as a mother. You've turned our family's struggles into something that helps other families succeed, and that's the most beautiful legacy I can imagine." Later that night, from my penthouse overlooking the Austin skyline, I called Kevin to debrief the retreat and plan future programs. Our conversation lasted for hours, covering logistics and programming, but also touching on larger questions about purpose and responsibility and the kind of success that actually matters. The Thompson Foundation now serves over 500 military families annually, with programs in 8 states and partnerships with dozens of corporations, universities, and government agencies. Kevin and Jessica have built something that will continue growing and evolving long after they retire, a systematic approach to veteran support that addresses real needs with proven effectiveness. Thompson Cyber Solutions continues protecting critical infrastructure and employing veterans in meaningful work that contributes to national security. The Pentagon crisis that had shaken my confidence led to innovations that made us stronger and more capable, proving that even significant challenges can become opportunities for growth and improvement. But the most important success isn't measurable in revenue or program statistics or media recognition. It's the transformation of family relationships, from comfortable assumptions to honest communication, from individual success to shared purpose, from personal achievement to community impact. Sometimes, the most generous thing you can do for your family isn't giving them what they think they want, but forcing them to discover who they really are and what they're actually capable of achieving. Kevin's wedding was expensive, but the conversations it made possible were priceless. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.